technologically literate. Okay. All right. I hope you can see these. Just one small caveat. I'm forced to mention this all the times, but nonetheless useful to say it, is that obviously so that I can be freer to say what I think and make this conversation more interesting, I'll be speaking my mind and therefore not reflecting necessarily what the European Commission thinks. So yeah, I wanted to give you an outline up front of what I want to talk about. It sort of hints at what it goes back to what I've already mentioned. So I think it's important to understand what economic growth is, and that's what I'm gonna reflect on at the beginning of the talk. Then we will look at GDP and how the two link together, and what its origins are and what its limits are, in brief. So again, this could be the topic of one whole lecture. I'll try to keep it short, and then go into the policy, more of the policy discussion, which is what I do and what you might be also more interested in, and say, okay, what in the face of all of this, what does this imply for all these discussions we hear about going beyond GDP? And the key word under number 3 is the sensible. So it's in brackets, so but actually it's the key word of the sentence, which is there's many ways to go about beyond GDP, but what is a smart way and a sensible way and a way that is useful, and it's not just a tick boxing exercise where you can tell the electorate that you've done something, but actually in the end you have not done anything consequential. I'm taking a bit of a risk in the sense that I'm going to present something. I'm going to try to be quick and to be broad and not to enter too much into the details, but perhaps because I'm much more interested in the conversation that we can have rather than me sitting in my living room and giving you a talk about the stuff that, or talking about the stuff that I already know I know. And so I'm much more interested in discussing with you what you're not convinced of. And I'm more than happy if you want to challenge my worldview or my understanding of these topics. And this is a 2.0 channel, and so I'm glad that Slido is being used to this end. So in terms of storytelling, it's not great, but I think it's useful in terms of lecturing to spoil the surprise and to state up front what I'm going to argue and what I would want you to take away from this lecture, or the things I would try to persuade you of. And the first set of findings that I will try to persuade you of is that economic growth is not something that has started recently. So it's not the Industrial Revolution, it's not the result of an industrial society, it's the result of specialization. And so in a way, it has characterized all of human history. Then, as we will see, of course, there was a change in pace with the Industrial Revolution, but it's not that economic growth started at the end of the 1700s or early 1800s. The second point I've tried to make is that GDP has problems. Again, I suspect I've looked a bit into the other lectures that you'll receive. I don't know if you've received this already or not, but I'm sure that you'll hear a lot about all the issues that GDP has. And what I will try to state is that, of course, it has limits, but at the same time, it does a fairly good job at tracking economic growth. And why this is important, which takes us to the third point, is that economic growth correlates with a lot of things that matter and the things that drive well-being, even though it doesn't measure them. So there's a lot of stuff that we care about that doesn't go into GDP, but we will see why. I'll try to discuss why. It correlates, so high income correlates with a lot of things that we care about. but it doesn't cause them. So correlation is not causation. So it's not that automatically high income, high growth means high well-being, which brings us to the fourth point, which is, in my opinion, the place where a Beyond GDP agenda can help is that it can help policymakers understand better the quality of growth, and therefore to make sure that this growth translates in the stuff that we really care about, and so to improve the relationship between economic growth and well-being, or the things that matter in life or to citizens. So starting with what economic growth is, it's fairly basic. I mean, it's a word or it's a term composed of two terms. One is growth, the other is economic. Growth means just that stuff after is bigger than stuff before, or that the delta is positive. Okay, the delta of what? So that's the first word, which is economic, or the economy. So the size of the economy is growing. That's what economic growth means. Which brings us to something that sounds obvious, and yet it's not entirely intuitive. We talk about the economy all the time, but when asked to define it, it's not actually that simple. A way to look at it is that the economy is the sum of all the exchanges, so whether for goods or services, the sum of all the exchanges for a price. Now the price can be, I don't care about whether the price is in dollars, in euros, or it's barter. So I'm giving you a bit of corn and you're giving me a utensil that you made. That's not the point. But the point is that we're having an exchange that is not benevolence. It is not just a gift. So when the neighbor comes up and you've just moved in and they give you, at least in American movies, that the neighbor always brings you a pie, a cake when you move in, that transaction is not a commercial transaction. It's just a gift, and so that doesn't enter the economy. I mean, I'm not going to enter into this now, but we can discuss about why that is the case, whether it is a problem, and so on at the end of it. So what you'll note is that in the textbook definition of what the economy is, there's nothing to suggest that this is a recent phenomenon. I'm not talking about, as I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be currency, it doesn't have to be dollars, it doesn't have to be recorded, it doesn't have to be all of the things that we do now, it doesn't have to come with a receipt. There's nothing that would suggest that the economy is a recent phenomenon, but this brings us to the question of when did the commercial transactions start? And the answer to that is basically when specialization started, which brings us to the question, when did the specialization start? And we'll see it in a second. By the way, you will see in the slides I'm using quite a few pictures from Egypt. This one is taken from an Egyptian tomb. I was in Egypt last week, and so while I was preparing these slides, I was very much intrigued by the things I've seen from a millennial civilization, a very ancient civilization, and so you'll see little snippets of this here and there. And this is comes from a tomb, and it depicts agriculture, which brings us to the next slide, which is a long historical background. It might be surprising that I'm talking about the origins of humankind when I'm talking about the economy, but bear with me for a minute, and you'll see why I'm talking about this. So human sapiens, our species, emerged roughly 300,000 years ago. Some say 200,000, some say 300,000, but to give you a sense, we've been around for a while. Early modern humans, which is basically us, so it's Homo sapiens, but with more behavioral traits that are similar to us. So it's those that started painting in the caves of Lascaux, I believe, in France, for example. Those are, or in Indonesia. So those are early modern humans, and they have been around basically for 50,000 years, which suggests that for the longest of our time, for the longest of human history, we have been basically living in some sort of hunter-gatherer society. Now, these societies were typically had some characteristics. They were small, they were not particularly specialized, they displayed a limited hierarchy, they were rather egalitarian, and they were nomad. Now, these things are intertwined, so I'm not just throwing adjectives in there. And the reason why they're intertwined is that because, so hunter-gatherers, effectively what you do is that you go and hunt for what you find something, you hunt it down, you eat it, or you pick berries, you pick whatever you can find that can be eaten, and you do that, and when you exhaust it, you move on. So when you can't hunt anymore, whatever you eat, you can't find it anymore, you move. And because you move, you have to be small. So you can't have a huge group if you have to move constantly. Also, you're not specialized, as in everybody sort of does the same things. So there's most people do hunting, those that don't do hunting do gathering. So everybody works on gathering food. Everybody sort of works on creating a shelter. So it's not like society is hierarchical where professions are defined, and I'm an economist and you are the carpenter, and that dude over there is in charge of fetching the food for everybody. We are all sort of doing everything, and this means that we don't we provide enough to survive, but we don't create a lot more, which means that again we're going to remain small, and we're rather egalitarian because again we're all doing more or less the same things, so it's relatively flat. We all more or less earn. I mean, the concept doesn't even make much sense, but we all sort of have the same goods. We probably eat more or less the same amount of food and so on. Some of these, now I don't want to give you the idea that, you know, this is like something from an ancient past. Some societies still exist to this day, and in hunter-gatherer way of operating. So it is possible. It's not like there has been a unidirectional evolution of human history. Now, 10,000 years ago, which brings us to the tomb of the pharaoh that I was showing you before. 10,000 years ago, what happened in Mesopotamia first, and then spreading, is that humans started to experiment with agriculture. And so you realize that you were eating some stuff, and that you could actually grow more of the stuff that you were eating. But if you start, so you start growing, let's say planting it and modifying the environment where you live so that you have more of the stuff that you eat and less of the stuff that you don't eat, the result is surplus. And so the result was that there was more food around. And because there was more food, there was a whole lot of implications. Again, it meant that you were no longer nomad, so you don't move anymore. You stay because you've planted and you want to reap the benefits of it, or you invest a lot of energy in cultivating, so you want to reap the benefits. So this is a bit the foundation of remaining in the same place. You start having dwellings. You start having progressively cities because you have population growth. Because having more food, you can have population growth. Because you're not moving, you can live in bigger communities. Because there is surplus, you don't need everybody to be working in agriculture. So part of society might be working on agriculture, but the rest can do other things, and therefore there is division of labor, and therefore there is specialization. So I start just being an architect, and I focus on being an architect, and I'm just the one that builds the houses, and I'm not anymore having to run around doing all the things that I need to survive on a daily basis. And then therefore there is trade, because I'm an architect, you make the food, I need the food, you need a house, and we start trading among ourselves and also with outside communities. And that's the birth of the economy. That's when the economy starts. And what I want you to understand is that because there was specialization, there started to be greater know-how. So the fact that I was the one building houses constantly meant that I progressively become better at building houses. And then I pass this knowledge on to whoever comes next. It might be my children, they continue the family profession, it might be somebody else, apprentice. And progressively through generations, you're building knowledge and you're becoming better at what you do. And this opens up more possibilities. It means that you don't have to build anymore just huts with wood, and you have new utensils, and with new utensils, there's more possibilities. You can start using stone as the Egyptians did at some point in their history, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the mechanics. And the sum of this know-how and growing know-how and population growth is the origin of economic expansion. Now, there is a common mistake that I would like to get out of the way. I don't know if this has been already raised by some of the other lecturers or not, or it's something you've heard elsewhere or not. But nonetheless, I'll give you the gist of the argument. And the argument is, basically, if you look at long-term estimates of the size of the economy, of which I'm showing you one on the slides, it looks like a hockey stick. So it looks flat, and then it sort of explodes, and therefore the conclusion would seem, basically, human history has been a history of stagnation, and then something happened in the 1800s, and growth started. And I don't know how to stress this more, but this is not what happened. So the reason why this picture looks the way it looks is because of the enormous success of the Industrial Revolution and what happened from the 1800s onwards in creating a lot more growth, and therefore overshadowing what had happened before. But it's not like growth didn't exist before and it started all of a sudden. And I was discussing this with Pascal, which already knew this evidence, to try and persuade you of this. I'm taking this index. It's basically an index of technological advancement. It was developed by a historian at Stanford, Ian Morris, and he tries to estimate a variety of things. One of them is energy capture. Now, energy capture, think about it this way. It's like when you're a hunter-gatherer, the energy you manage to capture is basically your food. And then you start using, you start navigating. You have boats and you start navigating on the Nile. So the energy you capture is also the energy of the wind. And then you start using animals. And so you domesticate animals. And so that is the amount of energy. So you get a sense, or you even going backwards, you start using fire, and so fire also gives you a source of energy, and so that gives you a sense that it's sort of an index of technological advancement and possibilities, which is what we were talking about before. Now, Ian Morris writes his book and develops this index because he wants to make an argument between the West and the East, which defines in a rather arbitrary way, and that's beyond the point for what we're trying to discuss here today. But the point that I would like you to see from this chart is that basically throughout the history of humankind has been a history of increasing technological advancement, only at a slower pace, effectively up until the end of the Roman Empire. During the Middle Ages, it was sort of a stagnation, or there was technological loss. And so there was a sort of a small recess. And then there is the explosion that we know about, or the huge improvement that we've seen since the 1800s. Now, this is, again, it's not crucial to what I'm trying to say here, but because of the evidence I'm showing, I cannot shy away from the obvious question that you would raise, which is, okay, but why, like what happened in the 1800s? I mean, on this topic, there's people who spend their lives researching. That's what growth economics, most of growth economics is about. There's a lot of books written about it and so on, but trying to really boil it down to a 1 minute, 2 minute slide. Basically, the type of growth that we had before can be characterized by what has been called as Smithian models after Adam Smith. And the reason why it's called Smithian is that if you read The Wealth of Nations, so the famous book by Adam Smith, he tries to explain stuff, and he uses an allegory. So he uses as an example a pin factory, and he says, you know, in a pin factory, labor is divided, and it's this specialization. It's what I was talking about before that helps the wealth to grow, to create the wealth of nations. So in a Smithian model, there's ever greater specialization of the type I was telling you about, and there's trade, which effectively are two sides of the same medal. Because the fact that you trade means you can specialize on the stuff that you're very good at, and you can do the stuff that you're very good at, and we trade, and this improves the amount of wealth that we're creating and generates economic growth, or increases the size of the economy. And this also brings about some innovation, but only relatively slowly. Instead, what happened afterwards is that there was a switch to a Schumpeterian model, where effectively you have rapid innovation. And rapid innovation feeds economic growth, and economic growth means you have more money to invest in innovation, and this creates a positive loop where you have explosive dynamics of the type we have seen. Which would bring us to the question, okay, but why did innovation accelerate at that point precisely? Let's say that there were the basis for this were set in the centuries beforehand, during the Renaissance, by a set of meta-innovations, and this could include the scientific method, going back to Galileo Galilei, could include the printing press of Gutenberg, it could include the belief in progress, a change in belief system. You know, we could go on and on this, and again, I'd be happy to enter more into the details if you so wish. I am drawing in this from a great book. If you wanna get your teeth into it, it's dense, so I'm not pretending that it's a light Sunday afternoon reading, but it's a very interesting book by Joël Mokyr, which is called A Culture of Growth. I'll be trying to give you snippets or references here and there throughout the slides, so you have some of these references throughout. Now, why GDP? I think, again, it's useful to give a bit of a historical origin to this whole discussion, in the sense that I've told you that, you know, economic growth was happening throughout, to a certain extent, maybe slower than what we have been used to and what we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, but it was happening throughout. But there was no measure of it. People sort of had an idea that it was happening, as in, throughout most of history, you know, reading ancient historians from Egyptian times, from even the Bible in some of its parts, from ancient Greece, you get a sense that people knew the civilizations that were successful, and typically successful meant a combination of there was abundance, so people didn't starve, to a large extent, or to a lesser extent than elsewhere. These civilizations were characterized by military power, so they could defend their territory or project their power abroad, and they were characterized by technological advancement. Again, looking at ancient Egypt, that's how it was characterized, including in the Bible, as a land where you know, things were possible, buildings were being built to an unprecedented extent. I think of obviously the pyramids, but also in terms of water systems, in terms of obelisks of huge dimensions, and being able to transport them. So again, there's a lot of technological know-how in there. But of course, there was no definition of the economy or of the concept of economic growth, which brings me to a small point that I think it's important to make, which is that economic growth or the economy is a mental framework. So it's a way in which we read the stuff that ancient historians sort of had in the back of their mind, but couldn't quite pin down, including Adam Smith to a certain extent. So it's a framework with which we read reality, but it's not like, it's a concept waiting to be measured out there, like gravity or gravitational waves or speed of light. So we try to, it's a framework with which we read reality, and then we try to measure it as much as possible. And that's when GDP would come into hand. But GDP hasn't been the first attempt. So even in those early days, rulers, people in power, were trying to make attempts to measure sort of what we would call nowadays the economy with our way of looking at things. For them, we're talking about mainly agrarian societies. So in most cases, it was trying to account for total agricultural production, or later on for national wealth. And again, we see this in ancient civilizations. In terms of national wealth, we start seeing the first experiments in England in the 1500s. And what was driving this desire to measure? It was ultimately to get us to, typically linked to taxation. So you wanted to know how much stuff your territory was producing, your land was producing, so that you could know how much you could potentially extract out of it, typically because of war. So typically, for the longest of time, governments were small. So basically, until the world wars, governments were very small. And so they weren't engaging in a lot of activities. It was typically small stuff, small stuff with respect to the spending we do nowadays. It was on things like security, defense, and little more, some projects, some infrastructure projects. But it wasn't the huge redistribution and social economy type of government that we have in mind, especially in Europe nowadays. Again, a useful reference for you could be a great book which has a clear title, or a title that is easy to remember given the subject, which is called GDP, A Brief Affectionate History by Diane Coyle, who is a British economist. And this is instead a very readable, small, easy book that you can read in a weekend. And it sort of tells you the story I'm talking about, of how did measurement start and why, and how it evolved. Which brings us to, let's say, the modern way in which we measure things. And so to GDP, I am gonna try and be brief on this again, because I don't know how much you've already heard of it. And a lot of this gets mentioned oftentimes here and there, so I don't want to be boring and repetitive. But to give you the very, very, very short story, just for those that have not heard it before, effectively, we started measuring the way we measure the economy around the Great Depression. And when the Great Depression hit, again, something interesting, because we always think that, we are now living in different times, and this is a recurrent mistake, let's say, throughout history. So in every generation, in every point in history, everybody thought they were living in a different point in time, and actually a lot of things are frequent, a lot of patterns are frequent. And one of them is, it's not that they didn't have indicators. So we often think, now we have big data and we have incredible statistics, and before they had nothing. Like, no, actually, when you look at it, they had a lot of high frequency indicators already in the times of, in the 1920s. They had indicators on export, on import, they had data on production, mostly of cars. They had information on wages, they had information on prices. But what they were missing was an organic view. So to bring all of these together and get a sense of where the economy was going, they were missing that. So they had to like base their sense of where things were going based on one indicator on car production, one indicator on exports. And they knew, again, you sense it, it's not that it was a mystery that the economy was tanking, but in the moment in which you're Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the newly elected president, and you want to address with big spending the situation in the economy and to prop up the economy, you've got to know how much the economy is contracting. And so, so he calls Simon Kuznets, who's a statistician and economist, ended up winning the Nobel Prize in the 70s for some of his work. And Simon Kuznets developed the first system of national accounts, or a first measure of national income. And this allowed to get a sense of the fact that the economy had been, the US economy had effectively been shrinking in 4 years by roughly 30%. And if you think about it, this is huge. This is like something that nowadays we see in war zone economies. So they knew that stuff was bad, but just they didn't have a measure of how much. And then they did. So they weren't flying blind anymore, and they could target their big spending, and or Franklin Delano Roosevelt could target his big New Deal spending plan or tailor it to the right dimension. Now, something that gets constantly brought up are some quotes from Kuznets himself, who at the time, I mean, these are direct quotes. There's one where he says that the welfare of a nation effectively can't be measured or tracked by a measure of national income. In another quote from later on, from the 60s, I believe, he said the distinction must be kept between, let's say, the quantity of growth and quality of growth, and so on. So we had warnings at the time where Kuznets was mentioning already, like, this is not necessarily translating, the fact that I'm giving you an index and it goes up doesn't necessarily translate in the fact that welfare for people is going up in the country. So what happened in between? For some people, the fact that GDP sort of became a guiding principle in our societies is a sort of historical accident. I probably wouldn't go as far, but effectively, I'll give you the story, which is what happened then is that the war broke, so World War II, and so the fact that the focus on national welfare sort of passed as a second line of concern, and the main concern was in maximizing production, especially in the United States, to meet the war effort. And so GDP, at the time it was called gross national income, so GNI, effectively was the measure that you needed. And after the war, you could say, okay, but after the war, then you can go back to focusing on welfare. And after the war, there was the Cold War. So again, there was a great rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union as to which country was going to go bigger and had the most resources and had the greatest number of military warheads and so on. And they were like in the condition of projecting their power abroad in the so-called third world, and so continuing the Cold War elsewhere. And in the meantime, this sort of, statisticians got together to try and standardize these measures, and so to create some international standards in the way we measure national income. And these were done first at the United Nations, then the IMF was involved once it was created, later on the OECD, and so effectively this created a lock-in effect, because one thing we like about GDP is that it's measured sort of in the same way, or it follows the same principles in every country, which means you can compare. And if I, in Alessio land, where I'm a dictator, I proclaim that I'm just going to use a different measure, I'm going to be alone in this, and therefore it's not going to be a great guiding principle if I'm the only one that uses it, and I don't know how in other countries, how it compares to other countries. So this creates a sort of lock-in effect. Now, what is the obvious agenda for the 21st century economist? I'm borrowing this expression from a book that you might have heard of, because I think that your initiative, in a way, is a spin-off of some of the work of this author, Kate Raworth, who wrote this best-selling book, Donut Economics, and where she says what are the 7 ways to think as a 21st century economist. And I'm paraphrasing, so here this is not a direct quote, so don't look for it in the book, but effectively the story goes. GDP was okay, it sort of served its time, it might have been useful back then, but nowadays it's not what we care about. What we care about is welfare. So let's just focus on the stuff that we care about, be it whatever it is, access to housing, years of life, of healthy life, quality of the air, amount of free time, you name it. So let's focus on that, and then, you know, who cares about GDP? To a certain extent, we could stop measuring it, and if it goes up, it goes up, and if it goes down, it goes down, but like we're doing the stuff that we care about. And this has been called sort of the agnostic perspective on GDP growth or GDP or economic growth. And again, I'm giving you a reference to a recent article who looks at this in greater detail as an approach. Now, I am not entirely convinced that you can just stop measuring GDP and that something will happen, something consequential will happen, to a certain extent because of what I told you, which is that if you look at human history, it's not like growth started because we started measuring it. Growth has been a phenomenon that has characterized most of human history, or most successful civilizations, while they were successful, and then when they collapsed, they didn't. But it's not like if we stop measuring it, like it would suggest that this is sort of an inbuilt feature, and not that if you stop measuring it, it will stop, or it will magically go away, which sort of suggests that, you know, it probably has some consequentiality, like that people were not dumb back then, before GDP was invented, and not even before the Industrial Revolution happened. So it must have been something that led different civilizations, different societies to continue specializing, to continue innovating, to continue developing greater know-how, and so on. And so what I'm trying to get at in this slide as a concept is, it's interesting that while GDP has a lot of shortcomings, and while it's true that it doesn't measure stuff that we care about a lot, especially these days, it doesn't tell you about inequality. It tells you, okay, the economy grew, but it doesn't tell you if it grew for the benefit of the few rich ones or for the benefit of the many poor ones. It doesn't measure the environment directly. So it has a lot of shortcomings. But what is interesting is that even though these things, so the environment is not factored in when statisticians compile GDP, it's not like the environment is one of the entries. Nonetheless, it is interesting that it correlates with a lot of the things we care about. And I'm giving you here a few examples of stuff we care about that doesn't enter GDP, but somehow it is highly correlated with it. Again, number of healthy life years, the quality of the air, participation in public life, number of people you can rely on. So, you know, this idea that personal connections are really important, and being able to rely on somebody. You ask people in surveys, how many people, or do you know somebody you can rely on in a moment of difficulty? You draw a chart comparing countries with their income per capita, and that correlates as well. The share of national parks, so the share of land that is devoted to national parks, the share of sea that is devoted to marine reservoirs, all of these things correlate with GDP, even though GDP doesn't measure these things directly. So this is an interesting conundrum. And here I've told you that these are things that matter in life, so I'm being rather technocratic. as in top down and telling you these are the things that matter. But even when you ask people themselves about their happiness, and I'm just drawing out the World Happiness Survey for 2020, even that, if you look at the top countries, they're all high-income countries. So something must be happening here. And to try and explain to you the way I look at it, I'm going to use a bit of an allegory. So a little story, and bear with me like 2 minutes, and we'll get to it, and then we'll wrap up this section, this slide deck straight away. So let's talk about something that we all experienced. You experience it, I experience it, everybody, which is time, and more specifically the 24-hour day. Now, in the 24 hours of your day, you have to allocate yourself to various things. Some that you like, some that you dislike. You've got to sleep, you've got to eat. Ideally, you've got to clean yourself to a certain extent with a certain frequency. You want to hang out with your friends, with your partner. You want to get some study in there. You've got to go to class. You want to go outdoors, do some sports perhaps. So there's a lot of things that you want to do. And you've got to, so you have trade-offs. You've got to decide, I'm going to study a bit more and sleep a bit less. I'm going to see my friends a bit more and sleep a bit less. It's always sleeping that is on the on the contractionary side. But anyhow, you have these trade-offs or difficult decisions. Now, what economic growth does is that over time, it implies that you have more and more hours. So in your day. So let's assume that at some point you have 40 hours in your day. Now, I can guarantee you that even if you had 40 hours in your day, you would still not be completely satisfied, as in of having done everything. You would probably squeeze in even more things. You would want to do more sports, several on the same day, and you probably want to see more friends, and you might want to sleep more, and you want to also study more and read more things, and perhaps study 2 different things at the same time, economics and international relations and history, after all the history I've told you about. So you would still have trade-offs, but potentially you have more time to invest on all the things that you were investing on when you had a 24-hour day. Now, to draw this example to a conclusion, and so to go back to this growth and the things that matter in life, the things that matter in life still need investment of resources. And so you want to invest in health, and you want to build more hospitals for that. You want to decarbonize your economy, you want to invest in green technologies. You want to work less. So you want to have, let's say that you don't like working, and so that working is a negative thing in your daily life, or you want to work less. You can do that without renouncing or without having less resources to do all the other things. And so eventually having more resources, which is what GDP or economic growth does, or GDP growth or economic growth does, allows you to invest in all of these things at the same time and increase overall well-being. Now, the way I try to frame it is that GDP's or economic growth is on the input side or of a policy-making box, let's pretend. So you have more inputs, you have more resources, it means you can do more things, but you still have to decide what you want to invest these resources in. And typically that's where democracy or politics comes into the equation, because that's where we as a society decide how to allocate, to make these allocation decisions. And that's why, to a certain extent, I see this, the interaction between, the positive interaction between capitalism and democracy. And these, we've seen that over the past 200 years are 2 forces that, it's an engine that works in tandem, and it works quite well. And the reason why it works quite well, to a certain extent, is that capitalism helps to foster growth, and democracy helps to make sure that that growth goes into the things that matter, or that we care about, we as a society care about, and therefore the things that matter. And so that the two are not necessarily working, we often look at them as in a clash, but actually they can also work in tandem, and they have worked in tandem in our economies to a positive degree. Final point, which brings us to the Beyond GDP and what we can do with Beyond GDP. Now, I don't want to give you the idea. I wouldn't want you to walk out of this class and be like, oh, okay, you know, growth and democracy do it all, and therefore I can sit back, relax, and everything is going to be fine. I think that there is value in a Beyond GDP agenda, and what a Beyond GDP agenda means is to actually measure the things we care about, what Kate Rayworth mentions. So let's have scoreboards, or let's look at indicators that tell us whether we have the appropriate amount of hospitals, whether what the level of inequality is, what the situation with housing is, and access to housing, what obviously environmental indicators and so on. So I'm not denying the utility of this, and the reason for it is that it allows you to shift from the left to the right, at least in my screen. So from a more primordial way of looking at the economy to a more broad and comprehensive way of looking at the economy. And this, however, doesn't mean that, you know, when you're moving from a Cinquecento of the 1960s from the left to a modern car, it doesn't mean that you stop looking at the fuel gauge. You still have the fuel gauge, which would be GDP in my allegory, but you are adding a lot of other indicators that give you a sense of how the car is doing before it becomes a problem. So you don't want it to become a problem, and for democracy to channel this and to decide how to allocate resources to this. Because in a way, you know, that's the way it would happen. You would have an increasing problem with housing, people would get pissed off. A politician would realize that there is this trend. He or she would campaign on a platform to change housing, and it would take some time, and you have to win elections, and it's going to be a struggle, and you've got to create coalitions. And once you're in power, you've got to fight against interest groups, and in the end, you're allocating more resources to housing, and you solve the problem. So that's the way in which democracy and capitalism would solve it, but obviously it takes a lot of time, it pisses a lot of people off, it creates mistrust in the system along the way until the change happens. So it's not it can be improved, let's say, and getting a sense, having a broader set of indicators can help you tackle it straight away. So to realize that housing is a problem straight away while you're already in government as a policymaker and allocating resources to that straight away. On that note, I've already taken way more time that I would have wanted, even though I'm on the 1 hour mark. So I respected the imposed duration. Just one word on, you could be wondering, where is Alessio taking all of this stuff from? And there are two basic sources that I've been drawing from. One is a book that I've been writing, and that is going to be out in April. So this is news. I haven't told anybody yet. You're the first ones to know. It's going to be out in April with Harvard University Press, and it looks exactly at the things that I've been talking about and more. So there's going to be more on the green dimension, let's say, on how to reconcile the economy and nature of the economy and the fight against climate change. And instead, the other paper, which is what I was called into this guest lecture for to begin with, is the paper called Economic Policymaking Beyond GDP. This I wrote for DG ECFIN, which is where I work, for the European Commission. It's public, it's available, you can download it, you can read it, it's short. It's not going to do you any harm. And that's it. I'll stop here. These are my contacts in case you want to reach out at some point, telling me how wrong I was and persuading me otherwise. And if not, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.